We're delighted to welcome you back for yet another in our series of book launch / foreign policy discussions. And I couldn't be more delighted today to welcome Sheila Smith, the Senior Fellow for Japan Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. Sheila really needs no introduction to this audience. She has kindly been to Perth on several occasions. Actually, back in 2015, she came here to launch her previous book, which was Intimate Rivals, focusing on the relationship between Japan and China. We did a large program together at Murdoch University and one of our normal foreign policy roundtables at UWA. In October of 2018, she kindly joined us for our inaugural WA Indo-Pacific Defense Conference. And our intent was to drag her back down here to Perth to launch her current book, which, as you'll see, is Japan Rearmed, the politics of military power. And unfortunately, like most major concerts, they have to work their way around the world before they get to Perth. We kind of thought that the book having come out just about a year ago, it was about time for her to come down to Perth. And unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic had other ideas. But we're very happy to have this format to be able to have a conversation with Sheila about the book and about other developments in Japan. Just as a short introduction, Sheila joined the Council on Foreign Relations after a stint at the East-West Center in Hawaii. She had previously been a visiting fellow at Keio University, had been a research fellow at two leading Japanese think tanks, the Japan Institute for International Affairs and the Research Institute for Peace and Security, as well as time at the University of Tokyo and the University of Ryukyu. She really is the preeminent specialist on Japan defense issues and military issues. A great friend of mine. The decade that we were together in Washington, D.C. Was a highlight of my 25 years there. And while I'm sad that we don't have you here in person, Sheila, it's great to see your face, and it's great to have a chance to talk about your book. So if we could kind of kick off, I went back and watched the original launch of your book at the Council on Foreign Relations. And I noted that you made a distinction between a title that was said Japan Rearming and Japan Rearmed. I thought that might be an interesting kind of segue into what the central themes of the book are, what inspired you to write it, and what we need to understand for it. And again, I will note that we'll put a link to the book on the website, so you can buy it or you can download an electronic version as well. We're delighted to hear your insights, and welcome. Thanks again, Sheila. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Gordon. It is delightful to be here and to see you, even if only virtually. I would jump on a plane and go to Perth anytime, but unfortunately not the world we live in at the moment. So hopefully we'll do that in the future. I'll be back. But in the meantime, thank you for having me, and thank you for highlighting my book. Let's start with the title and then why I wrote it. It's pretty straightforward. Richard Haas, who is the president of the CFR, and I had this back and forth about the title. And Richard has a very strong view about Japan normalizing. So he uses a different language, a language that we've all heard for the decades throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, that Japan is becoming more normal, right? In other words, its approach to military power is normalizing. I'm not a big fan of that language, but we can. It's my boss, so I didn't want to say that outright. But because we don't know what normal is. And I think that for a lot of Americans, the United States is normal. But I think if you sit in Perth or Canberra, or you sit in other capitals around Asia, that's not necessarily the model for how to think about military force, either developing capability or using it. But what I wanted to do actually with the past tense is to alert people to the fact that we should no longer be talking about whether Japan is a pacifist society or a militarist society. Those are the frames that usually come along with discussions of Japanese military capability and power. Instead, I wanted to draw their attention to the fact it's not that the Japanese haven't invested in military power. They have invested since they came out of US occupation. They've built a military, largely equipped air, maritime, and ground forces by the end of the 1960s. The question then was, what are they going to do with it, right? And how big did it need to get? So Japan has been rearmed for a long time. What I think is changing, though, is two things. One, in the 1980s, lots of political commentators thought, okay, Japan's got wealth. It will now translate that wealth into military power, and that has not happened. So that's an important thing to recognize about Japanese ambition. The second is after the Cold War ended, of course, there was a lot of demand on Japan, external demand on Japan, to think more carefully about the utility of military power. And that's where the subtitle comes in, the politics of military power. So how to use the capability, what is legitimate and what is not. And part of that answer is the conformity to Article 9 of the Constitution, but part of that answer was also about what the US expectations of Japan were. And as we get closer to today, of course, the expectations across the Indo-Pacific are also part of the mix. So the politics of military power, what I want to explain to people, and again, this book was largely written for American policymakers. I sat in Washington during the Senkaku confrontation with China, Jiaoyu, if you want to use the Chinese name for the islands. And so many people that you and I both know, Gordon, who know Japan and know Asia well, automatically thought there was going to be a military conflagration, that the Japanese could initiate the use of force. And so I wanted to help our policymakers get a better handle on the dynamics at home in Japan about certain aspects of when and how the Japanese government may decide to use force. Long-winded answer, but there you go.
Well, no, that's fantastic. You did mention that it was written primarily for a U.S. perspective, and yet sitting here in Australia, both Australia and Japan are treaty allies of the United States. We look at many of the same security issues in the region. What are the core takeaways from your book for an Australian audience? I realize it was intended for an American audience, but my guess is there's going to be keen interest here in Australia as well.
So I think it's important, to understand not only the capabilities that the Japanese self-defense forces bring to the table, and again, for Australian military planners, as well as your diplomats and your political leaders there, what Japan can bring to the table and when it might be willing to bring not only the economic or the diplomatic instruments to the table, but also the military instruments, I think is very important. But the second piece, and I think this is something that we all learn about in grad school, we forget to talk about it too much, right? When we think about military, there are two ways to think about it. There's a country's capabilities. In other words, what capabilities do they have and what can they do? But the other is the intentions piece, right? I had a really interesting conversation with a very senior New Zealand policymaker because I was down in New Zealand last summer. And he said the key piece for him and for many others around the region is, what are Japanese intentions? How do you read Japanese intentions? And I thought that was an interesting contrast, right? How is Japan how has it changed the way it thinks about the utility of military power and its capabilities? And then how does that feed into this broader dynamic? And of course, in the region where you live, and I'm a little bit far away from, right? The intentions of some of the major actors are the focal point of strategic debate. China, right? But not China alone, other North Korea. And of course, there's lingering under the surface. There's Asian concerns about, well, what about Japan? Could it change? How quickly could it change? And so I think that's another piece of the puzzle to consider.
One of the things that has been much more in my mind since I moved to Australia 6 years ago, and even more recently as I've become full-on Aussie, is that we focus a lot on the hub and spokes nature of the U.S. alliance network in the region, but we don't focus nearly enough on the relationship between the spokes. And that, as you know, I've spent a better part of the last 30 years as a Korea specialist. And for me, before I moved here, my prism of a U.S. ally was Korea versus Japan, comparative contrastive. And Australia is a very different model still. And what doesn't really exist in an institutional framework is kind of those relationships between allies, between Australia and Korea and Japan and the Philippines and Thailand in that regard. And obviously much work to be done there in that process. But I think from that perspective, the U.S. alliance community, the managers, if you will, here in Australia, are going to be keenly interested in your book because it speaks not just about Japan, but the U.S.-Japan relationship in that regard too. So I appreciate that. I wonder if I might move a little bit away from the book itself to a little bit more current topics. And that is politics. I've been following you on Twitter closely, the other pieces you write regularly for the Council on Foreign Relations and others. And a lot of what we've been thinking for the last 5 years, 6 years at least, has been premised on Prime Minister Abe Shinzo as Prime Minister of Japan. He's here on his second go around. He's been a remarkable leader by any accounts. I think at this point is Japan's longest serving Prime Minister in history. And yet there was, at least in the circles I run in, a presumption that his swan song, was going to be the Olympics. He was going to have successful, wonderful Olympics, and then he was going to ride off into the sunset and step down. I don't know if Japanese can ride off into the sunset since it's the land of the rising sun, but whatever the formulation of that is.
They exit like in Kabuki, they exit on the Hanamichi.
That's exactly right. That's exactly what they do. But now that all seems to be, thrown into chaos with the postponement, at least, of the Olympics and some political problems from Abe at home. I guess two questions in there. One, where do you see things going with political leadership in Japan, primarily with Prime Minister Abe? And what does that kind of mean for Japan's trajectory in the world, both in terms of your book, in terms of its security policy, and more broadly?
Thank you.
Easy questions.
Easy question. Sure. Let me predict the future of Japanese politics. No, it's we're 3 months into the pandemic, and I think we can make an assessment of the political impact of COVID-19 for those 3 months. I think what happens ahead, of course, who knows? In your country, my country, I think your country is actually doing pretty well. Amazingly. I wish we were living in the same kind of moment here in the United States, but clearly that's not true. And in Japan, I think there's two things to think about the Abe piece, as well as just Japanese politics more generally. The first is, the Abe, Prime Minister Abe and Chief Cabinet Secretary Suga and the LDP had a pretty serious plan for the Abe exit, right? And Mr. Abe himself has publicly said he's ready to exit. He's tired. Some of my political reporter friends think he can be persuaded to hang on. But, there was an idea that 2020 was going to go like this. There was going to be a certain economic, outcome in 2019. It's not going to be exciting, but it was going to be reasonable. That didn't happen, right? By the end of 2019, Japan's growth was only at 1.8. They had a very bad fourth quarter. So that was he was limping into 2020 on the economy. But the big picture, focal point was the Olympics. And the Olympics was going to be a boost to the economy. And I think that's the most important way to look at it, right? Is not only the massive investment that has gone into hosting the Olympics, but the exceptional amount of economic activity that was going to result from it. The second piece of 2020, of course, was the China visit. Xi Jinping was expected to arrive. The culmination of a very protracted and very difficult but careful orchestration of a very high-level summitry, where President Xi was to arrive in April for a state visit to Japan, and a new framing of that bilateral relationship, right? The other piece, of course, was, everybody expected an election by the end of 2020. It's a parliamentary system, which we don't need to explain to Australia, but you do have to explain to Americans. It's not like a presidential election. But the scene that was set was something like this: that Abe would come out of the Olympics, would come out with a pretty successful overture to China, would come out with a pretty robust set of numbers on the economy to demonstrate, and he would, have a general election in which he would run and lead the party. But then he would hand over leadership of the LDP to someone else. And, the Japanese newspapers were full of who that next person was. There was no question that Abe was leaving. But there was just who was going to come and who was his pick and who would the voters vote for, that kind of inside baseball. But COVID-19 has thrown all that out. And so the economy and the economic impact, I think we don't know how bad it is, but here in the United States, Japan, Europe, it's bad. We all know it's bad, and the recovery will be long and hard. So for years, right? So the Japanese is a globalized economy. It is a terribly vulnerable economy to the kinds of dynamics we're seeing today. And you add the oil market on top of that, you've got lots of variables there for Japan that are hard to manage. The other piece, of course, is the politics. I don't see how Abe can step down now. I certainly don't see how the LDP will want to dissolve the Diet and have a general election, because they'll need to get cleanly out of COVID-19, I think, for them to feel comfortable. The Japanese voters will think that they managed it carefully, both Abe and the party writ large. And then, of course, there's the Olympics still hanging out there now for the summer of 2021. So I think the script for 2020 has changed for Abe and for the LDP and for Japanese politics, and we'll have to wait and see.
You referenced at the last there the Japanese response to COVID-19 and the need to get out of it first. It's interesting, at least judging from the international media that I read, there's been a lot of focus on Taiwan and how well they've managed it, a heavy focus on Korea and how after some initial missteps they've managed it. And you rightly pointed out that over the last several weeks, there's been intense focus on Australia and New Zealand in terms of our strategies for dealing with this. There really hasn't been a lot of reporting on Japan, except for maybe the initial reporting around the Diamond Princess cruise ship. Can you kind of bring us up to date with,
Sure.
how the Abe government is handling the response and kind of where things lay of that right now?
Sure. So I think two things. I wrote a blog piece on Asia Unbound that sort of covers these first 3 months, so January through March. So if people want the details and the nitty gritty, then I can direct you there. But the big point is Japan's early strategy was the cluster strategy. It was much like South Korea's, with the exception of Japan did not put emphasis on the kind of testing, widespread testing that South Korea did. And there was resistance to the kind of application of technology that the South Korean government applied to that testing procedure. So it wasn't as transparent, but it did take this basic epidemiological strategy of identifying clusters, doing intense contact tracing, and then testing as they went. So testing numbers were low. There were several big events. In January, you had 4 cases, all of which were tied to China, all of which were tied to Wuhan, right? Exposure in China. By February, you're getting into the Diamond Princess, which was the cruise ship that was quarantined and sitting in Yokohama harbor, for which the Japanese got roundly criticized globally. I'm not sure the Japanese public was as critical, but the global chatterati were certainly critical. And there was some doctors inside Japan who began to say that this quarantine was not being run very well. At the end of the 14 days, Japan let a lot of people out that a lot of doctors thought shouldn't have gotten out. So there was quite a lot of controversy over that piece of the puzzle. And then you get into, rising numbers of community transmission that had nothing to do with China, nothing to do with the cruise ship. And you largely began to see in March that the numbers in Tokyo were picking up. And Japan, I think the Abe cabinet was slow on the uptake there to shift away from their original cluster strategy. I forgot to mention there was a cluster up in Hokkaido as well. Hokkaido, for those of you who know Japan, is the prime skiing resort for foreign and domestic skiers in January, February. So there was a cluster initially up in Hokkaido. But you had a couple of things that I think put the brakes on the Abe cabinet's response. The first was there was a lot of dithering over the legal framework, and could they act within the existing legal framework, which of course was created during the H1N1. So it was an influenza-based framework. The LDP thought they needed a new bill, it had to go to the Diet, had to get debated, and it, relatively speaking, it passed quickly, but I think it really did put the brakes on the ability to pivot.
That impacted their ability to do testing as well, right? The legal framework, right?
Exactly. So there was a very narrow and limited interpretation of the law that existed, and a very narrow or a pretty contested conversation about what constitutional limit needed to be on the next law. So lots of political dithering, I think, that seemed to slow the response. The second, of course, was the stimulus package. Because the numbers remained low, that Financial Times graph that we all have memorized, right, by the trajectories of numbers. Japan, remember, was still way down here, and I think by the end of February, there were hundreds of cases, not thousands, right? So you're still looking at pretty low numbers for the Japanese case, despite all of this, right? But by March, the numbers started to tick up. The acceleration of numbers in March was really beginning to make people think that Abe was going to have a real problem, and in the congested population centers that are Tokyo, Osaka in particular, but also Fukuoka, there was real concern that people were just not going to do the social distancing that needed to happen. So the new law allowed for a state of emergency. The Prime Minister declared that 2 weeks ago. He started very narrowly on these 3 urban clusters. It then went national a week later. It's about to be extended. They're going to have a cabinet announcement, I believe, on Friday that they're going to extend the timing. I think it was imposed through May 5th. But the Tokyo numbers, the percentage of numbers, caseload now, I think I don't have a number right in front of me, but I think they're about 14,000 cases. And Tokyo has about 30% of the share pretty consistently. So there's the sense that They may have mitigated the spread, but their medical system is massively overloaded. Their ICU, their ventilators, especially in urban Tokyo, where there's already a medical infrastructure problem to begin with.
And obviously, if you overlay that with the aging society issues in Japan, it becomes a country of particular concern.
Right.
I mentioned earlier on that for the bulk of my career, I've tended to view alliances, U.S. alliances, as kind of a Korea versus Japan kind of narrow prism. I have to confess that in the last year, I've been absolutely shocked, if not horrified, by the highly divisive and destructive U.S. ROK negotiations over cost sharing. And because these are things that Japan has to deal with as well, one of the worries I've had is that as you've seen what's happened at the U.S., and for those of our listeners who don't follow this closely, there is, of course, in the current world, a real strong case to be made that U.S. allies, be they in NATO, be they Japan, be they Korea, et cetera, are going to have to shoulder more of the burden. With what it seems to be growing American weakness, at least politically, a willingness not to shoulder the full burden. That there is a discussion to be had about others kind of shouldering more. But this particular debate in South Korea has taken place in the most acrimonious way possible. We had in January something I never thought I would see: a sitting U.S. Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State penning an opinion piece, an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, essentially calling a U.S. treaty an ally a deadbeat country that doesn't pay its bills. I mean, it's just shocking. Just last week, the president in one of his COVID-19 press conferences went out of his way to note that the South Koreans had offered him a lot of money, but he turned them down because it wasn't enough. And all these things that are done in public, which seem to make those private negotiations even more difficult, particularly in democratic societies like Korea or Japan. So the question I have for you, and I haven't focused on Japan as much, is it seems that 2020 is the year where, in spite of all the other things you're talking about, it's, to use an Aussie phrase, Japan's turn in the barrel, right? That Japan is going to negotiate some of the same issues. And I'm curious as to how those things are shaping up from your perspective.
Lots of good stuff in there, Gordon, to talk about. But, I think we should start the conversation by saying burden sharing, or cost sharing as it's now referenced, has long been a part of American foreign policy. The man that we both admire so much, who was the Senate Majority Leader and then went on to be the ambassador to Tokyo, Senator Mansfield, in the 60s, led the conversation about what became the Mansfield Amendment. And it was about getting the European allies to spend more on their defense after the recovery after World War II. So the 60s was very focused on burden sharing by our recovering European allies in NATO. In 1980s was Japan, because of course Japan was now the economic superpower, right, and trade competitor with the United States, and so the Congress began to get very interested in getting Japan to spend more on its defense. They backed away directly from the defense focus because, of course, everybody in the region said, no, please don't make the Japanese spend 2% of their budget on their military. It's too much. So they shifted their gaze a little bit, and this extends then to the ROK. They shifted their gaze to cost sharing, or money that would support the U.S. presence in both of those alliances. It's now in Japan, excuse me, there's a special measures law for South Korea, or agreement with South Korea. Japan refers to it as host nation support. It's both basically the same thing. There's also been underlying more recent conversations about cost sharing. There's been the consolidation of bases and the reconfiguration of force postures, which are very expensive things to do. So in the South Korean case, as you know, is closing lots of bases up north, right, and moving them south of Seoul to Pyeongtaek and other locales. In the Japanese case, of course, it's consolidation of bases on Okinawa, where there was protest, and then some facilities improvement in training facilities in Guam. So there's a price tag here that is also related to the way the operational side of the relationships are changing. But the Trump administration, President Trump, as you know, came into office. He campaigned on, why can't South Korea and Japan get their own nuclear weapons? Why do we have to defend them? And so he himself is very focused on allies and the free-riding allies, or the less delicate language that he uses to talk about our alliances, and threatened even in NATO to rescind Article 5 protections, right? Defense protections that have long been the centerpiece of the NATO alliance. So I think the South Korean example, right, has the Japanese policymaking community very worried about what's coming next. They are anticipating being in the barrel, as you say. In a normal situation, this summer would be the beginning of the preparatory setup of negotiations for the host nation support agreement. In the Japanese case, it's a 5-year agreement. Japan contributes somewhere in the 60 to 70% of the cost of deploying U.S. forces in Japan. So they are the kind of the good case study of alliance cost sharing, but nonetheless, the president and others, including National Security Advisor Bolton when he was in power, and others more quietly since, have basically said to Tokyo, it's not going to wash. Now, I think they tried to tell President Moon that he needed to quintuple or increase 5 times the amount of money that South Korea paid. I don't think that's going to be the ask for Japan, but we don't know. If you try to shift gears and say Japan spend not 1% of your GDP, but spend 2%, Japan couldn't do it, even if they tried over a decade or more. It would be hard to spend 2% of Japan's GDP on its defense. So I don't know that the policy team in Tokyo knows yet what's coming. The prime minister has tried very hard to invest in F-35s, to do the kinds of things that President Trump has wanted on the trade side. I think in some ways to head off the collision that he's witnessed between Washington and Seoul. Not sure this year if we're gonna see that happen though.
Like most of the questions I've asked, that was just another one that's designed to open the door for future conversations with you and for enticing you to come down to Perth to help us understand these as the situation gets better. Just a couple more questions and then we'll wrap up. And this is, again, on the econ side, but really more about the political leadership on the econ side. In 2018, Australia and Japan really shocked, I think, the world by leading the resurrection of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. They framed it the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But in the face of strong opposition from the United States, it was really a surprise to see these two countries working together to shore up a core component of what Aussies call the rules-based order. But it's been kind of quiet since then. There hasn't been any quietude in terms of continued, candidly, U.S. hostility to multilateralism or international organizations, most recently the World Health Organization, where interestingly, both Japan and Australia have staked out slightly different positions than the United States. But the question I really have is in that type of activity, does Japan have anything left in the tank? Are they, in this current environment, dealing with COVID-19, alliance relations with the United States, their own economy, are they still committed to the rules-based order, international institutions, and are they likely to continue to be a partner with Australia in reinforcing and shoring those up?
Right. I think Japan's place is its future strategic view is multilateralism is a must for Japan's interests, and it is the best place for Japan to use its ability to participate in, sometimes lead coalitions of like-minded countries. So you saw Mr. Abe not only join with Australia and others in this, to realize the CPTPP, as you said, you also saw Abe and the EU conclude a free trade agreement not long after. That was very difficult, could not have happened, I think, because the politics of the relationship with the United States have been so different. But I don't think it could have happened except for you had the realization that the Trump administration was moving away from multilateral organizations on trade, including the WTO, right? So I think, and you see the Abe cabinet, and Mr. Abe has long, been a fan of this idea, but you see a very sophisticated rendition now of regional orders, the regional order as well, which is the Indo-Pacific vision, not strategy, but vision. And I don't see I don't see the Japanese moving away from this. I think what's going to be hard is to consider how is the strategic relationship between the United States and China, and what kind of pressures that's going to end up putting on Japan. If all is equal and the US and China do not actually intensify their strategic collision, then Japan has lots of latitude, and multilateral venues are a great place for Japan to operate on a bunch of, a whole host of issues where they have really led some of the critical conversations. But if the U.S.-China strategic collision gets very intense, it will, I think, help weaken international organizations overall, either because of Chinese management, right? And again, the WHO story has several sets of pressures on it, right? And you'll see Japan having to make different kinds of decisions. If multilateralism is not going to be an effective venue for articulating and pursuing Japanese interests, then I think the partnerships, circling back to your original question, the partnerships in Asia with Australia, with India, with other countries, the ASEAN grouping, these are all going to become very vital for Japan, because its interests, of course, are first and foremost in the Indo-Pacific region, and when it comes to its prosperity and when it comes to its security. So I think the fate of multilateralism is something that I know that many policymakers in Tokyo are deeply worried about, and will be looking for coalitions of support to make sure that the US and or China can't completely hobble institutions that have long served a pretty valuable function around for all kinds of global actors, but particularly for the Japanese.
Well, directly related to that, the Japanese, along with the Australians and slightly later the Indians, were really leaders in the construct, the idea of the Indo-Pacific. In fact, in late 2017, U.S. President Trump kind of adopted kind of whole cloth the Japanese framing of a free and open Indo-Pacific. That's gone kind of different directions as U.S. policy has gone different directions too. Where does the Japanese strategy for the Indo-Pacific stand?
So I think it's been very, most of your listeners will remember that this is not the first articulation of this concept of kind of Japan spreading its wings to work with other democracies, to work all the way across not only East Asia, but to South Asia, and if necessary, to the East Coast of Africa. Partly this was initially a response to China, the concern over China's growing influence, but it was also an economic strategy. I think one that the Japanese felt was really their strong suit in the region. Excuse me. Where I think it is today is it's very sophisticated in the way you look at the graph that many Japanese will share with you in the government, right? It looks very complicated, but the reality is it's a very sophisticated amalgamation of Japanese influence, instruments of influence. So it's economic, it's diplomatic, it's encouraging the counterpoint to China on the infrastructure side of things. It is offering a different model of democratic values and sustainable development. So I think there's a whole package that Japan has put under that rubric of Indo-Pacific. That in a lovely volume that your organization published, I contributed a piece on how I think the Self-Defense Force now has joined in the way in which the Japanese think that they can help to create a sense of Indo-Pacific community. They now have added the military instrument as well. I think it's very important for the region. So I think the Japanese, whether it's Abe or Abe's successors, to link it to your domestic politics question, I don't see Japan moving away from this. I think it's been building over decades. Prime Minister Abe gets lots of credit for putting it first and front and being very consistent in articulation as well as implementation. But I think anybody who comes along behind him is not going to abandon that view, because I think it's central to Japanese interests.
Well, let me end with an unfair question. You're sitting in Washington, D.C., and as you might imagine, there's great anxiety around the world today about the United States, not just in response to COVID-19, but more broadly. So what hope can you give us sitting here in Perth that the United States might return to some sense of normalcy, leadership in the region or globally?
So
I'm fishing there. That was a fishing.
I know. Please. I wish I had a magic wand and I could say what's going to happen in November. But as you know, the 2016 election shattered lots of people's expectations about what the American people wanted, as well as how our election, or what we thought was an election that was had an obvious outcome. And that's not just Democrats, right? It was many Republicans, as you know. The choice seemed very stark between, candidate Trump and candidate Clinton. the choice is even more stark in 2020. And I don't say this with any great pride, honestly. As an American, that same sense of concern and worry about the future of the United States, not only in Asia, but globally, but also at home. The divisiveness in the country is real, and it's increasingly on display, even in moments of national crisis like COVID-19. And I think that's what gives us in the United States great pause about what it is that's going to bring the United States or the American people together, because the politics are visceral. They're angry and they're visceral. All that being said, I'm hopeful that when the American people are given a choice, they will choose a different outcome. And if they do not, however, if they decide that President Trump that's the vision that they see for America's future, then if I was inside the country or outside the country, I think it makes a very strong statement about the America that you're going to see, not only for the next 4 years, but for the next couple of decades. Because I think the real question is not just among political elites and that tug and pull that's constantly on display. It's really what the American people think they are going to get, and whether or not international engagement and responsibility and leadership is still valued. And I wish I could tell you that I travel around the country as you did when you were in Washington, to talk to many, many different places and people, and most of whom have an international interest, right? Otherwise they wouldn't come and listen to me. But yeah, there's questions that you get today that you didn't get before. Focus on trade, yes, and economic ties and how others are competing, and we should pull back. I think COVID-19 is going to strengthen that impulse, frankly, given our dependence on China for medicines and medical equipment. I think you're going to get a stronger sense that maybe that's the right path. On the security side, I get asked, why should we have people overseas fighting? Why can't these countries defend themselves? Why can't they fight for each other? So you are not getting a strong case for American engagement is good for America, but you're getting a very vocal and a very poisonous set of arguments for the world is bad for America. And that's, I think, I wish our Democratic candidate well. He's going to have a high hurdle on that one, because I think right now the American mood is pull up the drawbridges, right? The world's a dangerous place. We should just go it, protect ourselves. And I think there's a strong case to be made otherwise, but I don't know yet whether that's possible.
Well, that is concerning, but insightful and very important for us to understand. Sheila, thank you for doing this. This is a great pleasure. I know for a fact that our community here in Western Australia, and thanks to COVID-19, our expanding community in international will be really interested in this conversation. Again, we will place a link to your book on the website when we share this video. The book is Japan Rearmed, The Politics of Military Power. Again, I neglected in my initial introduction to thank you for the wonderful chapter you put in for our edited volume on Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific, entitled Implementing the Indo-Pacific, Japan's Region Building Initiatives. It's been an absolute delight to talk to you. I look forward to a chance once again to entice you to Perth, but future conversations on Zoom if that be the case. Thanks again, Sheila.
Thank you, Gordon. I'll be there as soon as I can. Take care of yourself.